War films are supposed to show bravery, so why were some of them quietly kept away from American audiences? Not because they failed, but because they showed too much, too real, too uncomfortable to ignore. These weren't just battle scenes, they were moments that felt disturbingly close to truth. And once you see them, the idea of heroic war cinema starts to fall apart. But one of these films went so far, it was almost erased entirely. A Walk in the Sun, 1945. There's no urgency here, no dramatic build-up pushing toward a single defining moment. A Walk in the Sun unfolds in fragments, conversations drifting, thoughts repeating, soldiers moving forward without certainty of what comes next. The film removes structure. What remains is waiting. Time stretches, movement continues, but direction feels unclear. The men advance, yet not with confidence, but with quiet uncertainty that lingers beneath every step. Violence doesn't arrive as spectacle. It interrupts, brief, disorienting, almost secondary to the psychological state of the men experiencing it. There's no build-up to prepare for it, and no pause afterward to process it. And that's what makes it unsettling, because the focus isn't on what happens, but on how it feels while nothing seems to happen. War becomes something quieter, less defined, and far more difficult to understand. The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1968. At first, it plays like a historical retelling, structured, controlled. Events are presented with a sense of distance, as if everything is already understood. But as the Charge of the Light Brigade unfolds, that distance begins to collapse. The battlefield isn't heroic, it's chaotic. Formations move forward, but clarity never follows. Orders are carried out exactly as given, yet they don't lead to resolution. They lead to consequence, and that shift changes how everything is perceived. Because when the charge finally happens, it doesn't feel strategic, it feels inevitable. The result of decisions already set in motion long before the moment arrives. What unsettled audiences wasn't only the outcome, it was the realization behind it, how preventable it seemed, how avoidable it could have been. Choices made far from the battlefield carry forward into destruction that cannot be undone. And once that sequence begins, there's no interruption, no correction, only continuation, only impact, only loss. If 1968. It doesn't begin as a war film, not in the traditional sense. A school, routine, structure, authority clearly defined. But If slowly transforms that environment into something else entirely. Control becomes pressure, pressure becomes resistance, and resistance eventually becomes violence. The shift isn't sudden. It builds, quietly, through small moments that begin to feel increasingly unstable. By the time conflict fully emerges, it doesn't feel like escalation. It feels inevitable. What makes the film unsettling isn't just what happens, but where it happens. A place meant for order becomes a space of breakdown. And once that breakdown begins, it doesn't stop. It expands, without warning, without resolution. King and Country, 1964. There is no battlefield in sight, no advancing lines, no visible enemy, just a courtroom, quiet and controlled. Where a soldier stands accused of something far more complex than failure. King and Country strips war down to a single moment, a decision made under pressure, judged long after the fear has passed. The conflict here isn't physical, it's internal. A man pushed beyond endurance is forced to explain an action that cannot be easily justified or easily understood, and the system around him doesn't pause to consider the weight of that pressure. It proceeds, calmly, formally. That's what makes it unsettling, because everything appears structured, rational, fair, and yet something feels missing. Context. The film suggests that war doesn't end when a soldier leaves the battlefield. It follows them, into judgment, into consequence, into moments where fear is no longer visible, but still defines everything that came before. There are no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just quiet decisions that carry irreversible outcomes. And that quietness is what makes it difficult to ignore. Tunes of Glory, 1960. There's no battlefield here, no explosions breaking the silence, no visible enemy to define the conflict. And yet, Tunes of Glory feels like a war unfolding in slow motion, contained within walls shaped by authority, pride, and control. Two commanding officers collide, not through physical force, but through pressure that builds beneath the surface. Orders are given, but they carry something more than instruction. There's tension in the delivery, resistance in the response, and meaning in what isn't said. What makes it disturbing isn't action, it's accumulation. The kind of pressure that builds quietly, without interruption, until something begins to shift. Every conversation carries weight, every silence feels deliberate, and over time, those moments begin to connect, forming something that can't be easily contained. The film exposes a side of military life that rarely takes center focus. Hierarchy becomes unstable. Discipline transforms into something more personal. Structure remains in place, but what exists within it begins to change. And as that change deepens, the outcome becomes unavoidable. For audiences expecting external conflict, this internal collapse felt unfamiliar, because it suggests something far more unsettling. That war doesn't necessarily end when the battlefield disappears. Sometimes, it simply changes form. Went the day well? 1942. It begins like a peaceful village story. Quiet roads, familiar faces moving through routines that feel untouched by conflict. Nothing appears out of place until it does. Went the day well slowly reveals that the threat isn't approaching from a distance. It has already arrived. Enemy soldiers are embedded within the community, hidden in plain sight, waiting. What follows isn't structured resistance or coordinated defense. It's desperation. Civilians are forced into violence without preparation, without training, and without time to understand what's happening around them. The transition is immediate, sudden, personal, and that shift changes how everything is experienced. What makes the film unsettling isn't the scale of conflict, it's proximity. The violence doesn't unfold on distant battlefields. It happens inside homes, across farms, within spaces that once represented safety. Familiar environments become uncertain. Trust becomes unstable. People who were never meant to fight are suddenly making irreversible decisions, not as soldiers, but as individuals trying to survive. For audiences, this felt uncomfortably close, too immediate, too intimate. War was no longer something observed from a distance. It had moved inward, into everyday life, into ordinary spaces. And once that boundary disappears, it becomes far more difficult to look away. The Ipcress File, 1965. It doesn't appear violent at first. There are no battlefield sequences, no visible injuries, no immediate sense of danger. But the Ipcress File introduces something far more unsettling: control over the mind itself. The interrogation sequences are where the film crosses its line. Flashing lights repeat in patterns that feel deliberate. And sound becomes disorienting, almost rhythmic. The environment closes in, removing any sense of stability. It isn't designed to inflict pain. It's designed to dismantle resistance, slowly, methodically. And that shift changes everything, because the experience becomes invasive, almost claustrophobic. Viewers aren't positioned outside the moment, they're drawn into it. The same confusion, the same loss of clarity, begins to take hold. At a time when war films focused on physical threat, this psychological approach felt unfamiliar and more difficult to process, because it suggested that control didn't require force, it required influence, the ability to reshape perception until reality itself became uncertain. That idea doesn't resolve with the end of the scene, it remains. The Cruel Sea, 1953. There's a moment in The Cruel Sea that changes everything. A ship releases depth charges, fully aware that survivors remain in the water below. It isn't confusion, it isn't error. It's a decision made within seconds, under pressure that doesn't allow hesitation. And that's where the film becomes difficult to watch. War is often framed through clarity. Choices are presented as defined, outcomes as justified. But here, those lines dissolve. The characters are forced into actions that feel necessary and devastating at the same time. The ocean becomes more than a setting. It becomes a space where survival overrides morality, where stopping to reconsider could mean losing control of the situation entirely. And once the action is taken, there's no reversal, no correction, only consequence. What unsettled audiences wasn't the act itself. It was the reasoning behind it, the quiet understanding that, in that moment, there may not have been another option available. That realization doesn't resolve, it lingers, Because the film doesn't attempt to soften what happened or guide the viewer toward a clear interpretation. It simply presents the moment and moves forward, leaving its weight behind. And sometimes that weight, those unanswered questions about necessity and consequence, becomes far more difficult to face than the violence itself. Oh, What a Lovely War, 1969. At first it feels almost theatrical. Bright colors fill the frame, music carries the rhythm. Performances appear slightly removed from reality, as if everything is being presented through a controlled, almost staged lens. But, What a Lovely War uses that contrast to introduce something far darker beneath the surface. As the film progresses, the tone begins to shift, not suddenly, but gradually, almost without notice. Humor starts to lose its weight. Songs, once light and expressive, begin to reflect something else: inevitability, repetition, loss. And the cheerful presentation, once inviting, starts to feel uncomfortable in a way that's difficult to define. Then the final sequence arrives. Rows of white crosses stretch across the landscape, extending beyond what the frame can fully contain. Each one represents a life lost. There's no movement, no sound, no attempt to guide the viewer's reaction, just stillness. And that image remains. What gives it impact isn't graphic detail, it's scale. The realization that individual stories have been reduced to markers, and repeated endlessly across the ground. The absence of motion becomes part of the message. For audiences expecting traditional structure, this approach felt disorienting. The film doesn't direct emotion, it reveals it. It presents the outcome without framing how it should be understood. And once that realization settles in, the distance between presentation and reality disappears. Battle of Britain, 1969. There's no dramatic pause when a pilot is hit. No final words delivered over fading sound. No heroic farewell to mark the moment. In Battle of Britain, aircraft are present 1 second, and gone the next, without warning, without emphasis. The film approaches combat with precision. Dogfights unfold without exaggeration or cinematic framing. Movement is fast, technical, and often difficult to follow. Its damage feels mechanical, sudden, irreversible, and final. And that realism removes something audiences often depend on: closure. Loss happens quickly, quietly, without recognition. There's no time to process what's been lost, no shift in tone to acknowledge it. The film continues forward, mirroring the pace of the conflict itself. Events don't pause for reflection. They move past before they can be fully understood. What makes this unsettling is the detachment, the absence of emotional framing. Viewers aren't guided toward a specific reaction. They're left to interpret what they've seen on their own, without direction or reinforcement. And that creates a different kind of tension, because in reality, war doesn't organize itself around meaning. It doesn't slow down to provide clarity. It simply continues, regardless of whether those within it understand what's happening. This approach strips away the sense of spectacle that many war films rely on. What remains is something colder, more distant, and far more difficult to ignore once it settles in. The Dam Busters, 1955. On the surface, the Dam Busters presents a mission, a target, a clearly defined objective that moves forward with precision and intent. Planning leads to execution, and execution leads to impact. And in that moment, it appears to align with the familiar structure of success. But the film doesn't fully turn away from what follows. Once the objective is achieved, the consequences begin to unfold in ways that feel harder to contain. The destruction isn't isolated, it expands outward. Water surges forward, reshaping everything in its path, and moving beyond the original point of impact. And while the narrative remains focused on strategy, something else lingers in the background, something less defined, but impossible to ignore. This is where the discomfort begins. Because the film allows two realities to exist at once: the success of the mission and the scale of its aftermath. Neither is dismissed, neither is fully explained. They are simply placed side by side. For audiences expecting resolution, that contrast felt unusual. War films often guide interpretation. They emphasize outcome, reinforce purpose, and provide a sense of closure. Here, the structure pauses just long enough to introduce uncertainty. Questions begin to form, not directly but through implication. Questions about cost, about impact, about how success is measured when viewed from a different perspective. Yeah, and once those questions are introduced, they don't resolve with the end of the sequence. They remain. Ice cold in Alex, 1958. There are no large-scale battles here, no dramatic confrontations breaking the silence, no sudden turning points that reshape the journey, just a small group moving through the desert, slowly, steadily wearing down with each passing moment. Ice cold in Alex transforms survival into something physical, not symbolic, not abstract, tangible. Exhaustion is visible in posture, in movement, in the way decisions begin to slow. Dehydration doesn't sit quietly in the background. It alters behavior, affects judgment, shifts tone. Injuries don't fade with time. They deepen. They linger. Every step feels heavier than the last. What makes the film difficult to watch isn't what happens. It's how long it takes to happen. The pacing refuses urgency. There's no attempt to compress suffering into something easier to process. Instead, it unfolds in real time, gradual, uninterrupted. Viewers aren't given distance from the experience. They're placed inside it, forced to sit with it, to feel the repetition, the fatigue, the quiet strain that builds without release. And that creates a different kind of tension, because the threat isn't sudden, it's constant. The desert doesn't attack. It doesn't explode into action. It drains, quietly, patiently, without pause. Every mile removes something: energy, clarity, stability, until what remains is reduced to function. Movement without certainty. By the end, survival doesn't register as victory. It feels conditional, narrow, almost accidental. And that shift from triumph to endurance reshapes everything that came before it. The Hill, 1965. There is no enemy in sight, no battlefield stretching across the horizon, no incoming fire to signal immediate danger. And yet, The Hill becomes one of the most punishing war films ever constructed, because the threat is internal, controlled, and deliberately sustained. Set within a military prison in the desert, the film strips war down to something quieter but far more suffocating. Discipline is no longer about structure. It becomes an instrument. Soldiers are forced to climb a man-made hill repeatedly under relentless heat, not as training, but as a calculated method of breakdown. Each step is measured. Each command is intentional. The violence here isn't explosive. It doesn't arrive in bursts or chaos. As it is repetitive, controlled, systematic. And that pattern is what makes it unsettling. Because nothing feels accidental. Everything feels permitted. Authority figures aren't framed as protectors maintaining order. They become sources of pressure, figures who enforce control, not through urgency but through persistence. The cruelty isn't loud. It builds slowly, layer by layer, until resistance begins to fade. The film refuses to offer escape. It doesn't shift tone or provide relief through contrast. It remains inside this environment, forcing the viewer into the same cycle as the characters. Repetition becomes structure. Exhaustion becomes rhythm. And gradually, that cycle reveals its purpose. Not endurance, but erosion. Physical strain is only the surface. Beneath it, something else is being reduced. Identity. Defiance. The sense of self that once resisted control. By the end, survival no longer feels like the measure of outcome. The question changes. It becomes quieter, but far more difficult to answer. Not who made it through, but what, if anything, is left of them when it's over. Cross of Iron, 1977. There's no sense of direction in Cross of Iron, no clear objective, no moment where everything aligns into something recognizable. What you're left with instead is fragmentation, scenes that feel disconnected, movements that don't lead anywhere, and decisions made without certainty. Just chaos. The film places viewers directly inside that disorder, where war isn't a sequence of events, but a constant state of instability. Soldiers move forward, then backward, then sideways, sometimes without understanding why. Orders exist, but they don't always clarify anything. They simply keep the motion going. Combat isn't presented as spectacle. It's abrupt, disorganized, often over before it can be fully processed. One moment there is silence, the next there is impact, and then it's gone again, leaving only confusion behind. There's no time to assign meaning to what just happened, and within that confusion, something else begins to surface. Fatigue, not just the physical exhaustion of movement and survival, but a deeper, more persistent erosion, emotional fatigue, the kind that builds gradually until reaction replaces reflection. The characters don't pause to question. They don't deliver speeches or define purpose. They respond, adapt, and continue, because stopping would mean facing something they can't afford to confront. What makes the film difficult to process is its refusal to organize itself into a structure that feels complete. There is no clear progression, no satisfying resolution waiting at the end. Events don't build toward closure. They simply accumulate, only continuation. And that continuation becomes the message. War, as presented here, doesn't construct meaning. It strips it away, slowly, repeatedly, until what remains isn't clarity, but absence. And once that erosion begins, it doesn't reverse. It doesn't pause. It just continues.